It was the kind of photograph that hangs in a hallway no one uses, printed in slightly faded sepia tones, framed in oak, centered precisely between two doors that remained permanently locked. The photograph showed a man mid-stride, hand outstretched, crossing a finish line just barely behind another. The label beneath it read, "Runner-up, State Finals, 1993, Boston Regional Track Championship, William North." Most people passed it without a second glance, but not the man who visited the hall every Tuesday at 6 p.m. He would arrive just before the custodial staff completed their sweep, walking with a careful pace down the dim corridor on the third floor of the old sports facility on Arliss Street. His coat was always pressed, though clearly worn at the elbows, his shoes polished but cracked near the toes. He carried nothing with him, no phone, no water bottle, no gym bag, only himself and the weight of something unspoken. He would stop in front of the photograph and stare at it, motionless, for exactly 3 minutes. Then he would nod once, small, mechanical, and leave. No one asked why, and he never offered a reason. The staff called him second place, half affectionately, half curiously. Some thought he was the runner in the photograph. Others assumed he was someone related, a son maybe, or a brother. But over the months and years, no one found a name. No one found a record. He was simply there, always at 6 o'clock, always on Tuesdays, always looking. The building itself was forgettable, a repurposed civic center once meant to be a grand athletic hub for the city. Over time, it had become a skeleton of its former self. The gymnasium was now a half-used basketball court. The pool had been filled in and replaced with folding chairs and ceiling leaks. Upstairs, the hallways were quiet. Lights flickered in uneven rhythms. The paint peeled gently in corners no one reached. But the photograph remained, and so did the man. What no one knew, what no one even guessed, was that his name wasn't William North. It was Andrew Kerr. And Andrew had come in first. 32 years earlier, he had stood on the same track shown in the photograph, winded and sweat-streaked, his chest heaving beneath a white and gold jersey. He had crossed the finish line a fraction of a second ahead of the man beside him, William North, and raised his arms without thinking, without joy, almost instinctively, as if to say, "This is who I am now." The win should have been his, but it wasn't. An officiating error, a timing malfunction, a photo finish lost in the shuffle. For reasons never explained to him, not formally, the win was awarded to North. Second place was listed under Andrew Kerr. The medals were handed out. The newspapers ran the wrong story. The ceremony ended. Andrew left quietly, too stunned to object. He was 18 years old. He never ran again. In the decades that followed, he told no one the truth. He attended college, studied mathematics, and eventually became a high school teacher in a neighboring town. His name was never associated with track again. He married briefly, divorced quietly. He lived alone in a second-story flat above a bookstore where the hours slipped past without urgency. But every Tuesday at 6 p.m., he returned to the hall. It wasn't bitterness that brought him back. Not anymore. The anger had dried up years ago. It was something more complicated. A need to stay close to the point where everything had tilted slightly in the wrong direction. A way to stay tethered to a moment that had split him in half. He knew he would never be recognized. He didn't want to be. But he also knew that something inside him had remained unfinished, like a sentence left mid-thought in a journal he could never throw away. One Tuesday in early spring, something changed. There was a slip of paper tucked beneath the wooden frame of the photograph, not taped, just pressed lightly into the corner, as if someone had inserted it for only one person to notice. It read, "Why do you keep coming back?" The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, slightly angular. It wasn't a staff member. Of that, Andrew was certain. The question was too direct, too carefully phrased. He didn't touch the paper. He read it once, then again. For the first time in 17 years of weekly visits, he didn't nod when he left. That night, he didn't sleep. Andrew returned the following Tuesday, earlier than usual. The hall was empty, just as he expected, and the photograph remained unchanged, save for the absence of the slip of paper. It was gone. removed perhaps, or claimed. He stood longer than normal, 5 minutes, then 7. The silence of the corridor pressed in. The lights above flickered gently, their irregular rhythm matching the uneven pattern of his thoughts. He hadn't decided what he would do if the paper was still there. And now that it wasn't, he wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or disappointed. For most of his adult life, Andrew had believed himself hidden in plain sight. Time had allowed him to slip beneath the surface of attention. He walked through the world with the comfort of anonymity, shaped not by who he had been, but by what he had chosen to let go of. But the note disrupted that logic. It was not the question that disturbed him. It was the implication that someone had noticed. Someone had watched. Someone had cared enough to ask. For the first time in years, his visits to the hall no longer felt solitary. That week, he returned to the memory of the race with sharper focus than he had in decades. Not just the finish, but the weeks before it. He remembered the preparation, the feel of the track beneath his shoes in the early morning, the weight of expectation, not from coaches or crowds, but from himself. He remembered William North, too, confident, slightly reckless, a natural runner, the kind who won more from instinct than discipline. There had been no animosity between them, no rivalry beyond what was expected on a stopwatch. But after the results were misrecorded, after the title and the spotlight were awarded to someone else, they never spoke again. Andrew had wondered if North ever knew, if he ever saw the mistake and chose to remain silent, or if he too believed the error to be correct, if the win had somehow rewritten his own memory of the race. Those questions had lingered for years. Now they returned with new weight. The following Tuesday, Andrew brought something with him, a folded note of his own, a response simple and short, written on thick paper with the same kind of careful restraint that had guided his life. He didn't know if anyone would see it, but he placed it under the frame anyway, held there by the edge of the wooden backing. It read, "To remember what I was supposed to become." He did not stay long that evening. He walked home through the city's quieter streets, where the sidewalks shimmered with the reflection of street lamps in spring rain. The rhythm of his steps was slower than usual. Not tired, just thoughtful. By Thursday, he found himself returning to the old boxes in his closet, records he hadn't opened in years, letters, forms, photographs. In the back of one box was a binder containing clipped articles from the 1993 Regional Championship. Yellowed now, fragile. The headlines all repeated the same name, North Wins Gold. One photo showed William with a medal around his neck, beaming, unaware of the shadow just behind the lens. Another clipping listed the official times. Andrew's own was 0.02 seconds slower than what his watch had shown that day, a discrepancy he had noticed at the time, but which no one had taken seriously. He held the paper in his hands for a long time before placing it flat on the table and smoothing the edges. The finish line, once sharp and definitive, had grown soft in memory, but now pieces were returning, not just of the race, but of the feeling, of the loss, not of a medal, but of identity. The next Tuesday, the hall felt warmer somehow, the air less stale, the photograph unchanged, but behind it, another note, new paper, same handwriting. What if it was never about the race? This time he took the note with him. The note rested on his desk for days. Andrew didn't open the window near it. He didn't move the book stacked beside it. He barely touched the surface of the desk at all, as if any disruption might cause the paper to lose its meaning or vanish entirely. The question it posed had no clear answer, not one he could define. What if it was never about the race? It haunted him, not because it was provocative, but because it implied a truth he had never allowed himself to consider. For 30 years, the race had lived in his mind as a single event, a pinnacle, a dividing line between what he was and what he could have been. But now the question pressed against the edges of that narrative. If it wasn't about the race, what was it about? Identity, purpose, witness? He began to reconsider the details, not just the finish, but everything surrounding it. The hours, the training, the quiet mornings on the track when no one else had shown up. The moments afterward, when the race was lost but nothing else had truly changed. His life had continued. He had eaten dinner that night. He had slept even. Time had moved forward, undeterred. The tragedy had lived only in his interpretation of it. On the next Tuesday, he arrived early. He sat on a bench down the hall, out of sight from the photograph, and waited. At 5:47 p.m., someone arrived. A woman, late 30s, maybe early 40s, walked with purpose down the corridor, glanced once at the photograph, then slipped a folded note behind the frame. She stayed only a moment, then turned and left without seeing him. Andrew didn't move. He simply watched. She had not appeared familiar, but there was something in the way she moved. Not rushed, not nervous, but intentional, as if she were following through on a promise she'd made to herself. Once she had gone, he stood slowly and approached the frame. The note was there, waiting. He opened it with care. Would it have made your life different, or just your memory of it? He held the paper in both hands. For the first time, he didn't feel interrogated by the words. He felt seen. That night, for the first time in years, Andrew opened an old journal. Not a record of races or regrets, but a practical notebook from his teaching days, filled with lesson plans, notes to students, reminders to call parents. He scanned the pages for signs of the person he had become after the race, and he found them. There, in his precise handwriting, were things that had mattered, encouragements written in the margins of tests, an idea for a class discussion on effort versus outcome, notes from students thanking him for staying late after school to help them prepare for college applications. None of these had ever felt like compensation. At the time, they had felt ordinary, but now reading them again, he saw something else. Impact. Real, lived impact. Measurable not in medals, but in moments. The race may have shaped his memory, but it had not stolen his life. The next Tuesday, he returned again, no longer searching for confirmation, but out of curiosity, of who the woman was, of what the next note might say. There wasn't one, but she was there, standing quietly down the hall, waiting, this time not to place a note, but to watch the man who always came at 6 o'clock. Their eyes met, and there was no surprise in hers, no hesitation. She stepped forward slowly, handed him a folder, slim, manila, tied in string, then nodded once and left. No words were spoken. Andrew held the folder loosely, unsure whether to open it there or later. He chose later. When he reached his apartment and untied the string, he found a copy of the official event record from the 1993 championship, but altered. A photocopy of a results sheet with 2 times. William North, 4 minutes, 12.86 seconds. Andrew Kerr, 4 minutes, 12.83 seconds. Underneath, a page clipped from a private letter dated years after the event, from North himself. It was a confession, unsent. In it, William acknowledged the error, stated that he had known for years, explained that he had never come forward, not out of malice, but out of shame, that the win had given him opportunities he was afraid to risk losing, that he had carried it for years and that he was sorry. The letter was signed by North. Below the signature was a postscript. If anyone finds this, tell him I knew. And I was never the winner, not really. Attached to the folder was one final slip of paper in the familiar angular handwriting. He was my father. Andrew sat for a long time. He did not cry. He did not smile. He felt something quieter, a slow untying, a loosening of a rope he hadn't realized was still around his chest. It hadn't been about the race. It had been about being seen, and now he had been. The folder remained open on the table for days. Andrew didn't put it away. He didn't hide it, but he also didn't move it from its place, as though to do so might collapse the truth it contained back into doubt. The papers lay flat, still. The signature was unmistakable. The postscript, brief but honest. There was nothing else to interpret. The letter had been real, and more remarkably, it had been left for him. Not as an accusation, not as restitution, but as a gift, a final acknowledgement passed quietly from father to daughter, then from daughter to stranger, a delayed act of courage. Andrew thought often about the woman who had handed him the folder. There had been no ceremony in the exchange, no apology, no explanation, just a handoff, direct, human. The kind of moment that would fade quickly for anyone else. But for him, it lingered. He wondered what it had cost her to find him, whether she had hesitated, whether her father's confession had burdened her or liberated her, whether she had visited the hall before, whether she had ever run. That Tuesday, Andrew arrived at the hall later than usual, closer to 6:30 than 6 o'clock. The corridor was mostly empty. The photograph was still there, unchanged. The man labeled runner-up still chasing the man incorrectly remembered. But something in Andrew's posture had shifted. He didn't stop for his usual 3 minutes. He didn't study the angle of his stride or the line of the ribbon stretched across the frame. He simply glanced at it, then walked on. Past the photograph, past the hallway, toward the stairs that led to the ground floor. He didn't look back. Outside, the wind carried a warmth it hadn't held in months. Early spring again. The edges of the city beginning to soften, the light returning. He walked not toward home, but toward the park 3 blocks away, the one with the soft gravel track circling a small patch of field. He hadn't run on it in years. He didn't intend to run now, but he wanted to see it. When he arrived, it was nearly empty. A boy with headphones moved at a steady jog. A woman walked a small dog along the outer loop, and Andrew stood by the bench just before the curve, the one where he'd once sat with a stopwatch, long after his own racing days had ended. He sat for a while, not thinking, not remembering, just sitting. Eventually, he reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a new piece of paper, one he'd written himself. No grand message, no explanation, just a statement. My name is Andrew Kerr. I finished first. I lived second. I leave it here. He folded the page and tucked it into a copy of the newspaper clipping. The original results, yellowed and worn. Then gently, he placed it under the bench and walked away. In the weeks that followed, Andrew continued his routine, but the Tuesday visits stopped. He no longer needed to return to the hallway. The photograph, the title, the mistake, they no longer held him. He walked more now, ate slower, spent long mornings near the window, reading books he'd ignored for years. Once he stopped at a local bookstore and asked the clerk if they carried any novels by a runner named North, the daughter perhaps. They didn't, but he made a note to check again someday. One evening, while walking through the park, he passed a young man stretching beside the gravel track. The boy stood, nodded respectfully, and gestured toward the loop. Andrew smiled and kept walking. It was enough. At home, the folder still sat on the desk, but the pages had been neatly returned to order. The string had been retied. Beside it was a blank notebook. The first page read, "For what I almost became and who I did become anyway."